What does it mean beyond connecting the dots? This is a presentation done for the Oceania Chapter of the System Dynamics Society on March 27, 2024. The intent is to try and provide some of what I considered the most relevant insights that I've had, aha moments, you might say, over the last 5 decades since I became interested in the systems paradigm. The difficulty has been trying to figure out how much to include to make it meaningful and how many things to leave out so it's not overwhelming. So you can let me know at the end how that turned out. So this particular journey for me started in 1975 when a computer science professor said, for this semester we're going to read Stafford Beer's Platform for Change, which for me was like what they tell me, it's like taking mind-altering drugs, because to say that I became an evangelist for the systems paradigm would be an understatement. To the point where when people asked me what I did, you could typically see their eyes glaze over as they were asking themselves probably, why did I ask and how do I get him to stop? Though I persisted, and over time I began trying to develop a level of expertise in system dynamics. And that journey began on an IBM 360 in GPSS, where, the environment where you use 80-column punch cards and you have to punch out the instructions for the computer and you turn in your deck to the computer operator who runs them overnight. And the next morning you get back a printout that says you got an error someplace on such and such a card and such a column, and you go fix it and you turn it in again. And you do this over and over again until finally you get it right and it runs. It's absolutely less interesting than watching paint dry. And it wasn't until 1991, I think, that Stella became available for my Macintosh, and I thought I'd died, had gone to heaven. So in continuing to do that, one of my biggest questions was where to start. So that my worst enemy was a blank sheet of paper. And because I had a blank sheet of paper and I always wanted to get things right, my concern was, where do I start? And because I didn't know where to start, then I still ended up with a blank sheet of paper, and I ended up in this vicious reinforcing structure until I finally realized that it doesn't matter where you start. If you do a faithful investigation of the relationships and their implications, you'll come up with a model that is typically meaningful to some extent. Because the pieces are all connected. There are probably better places to start than others, though starting is the most important aspect of it. That continued, though, as I continued to develop models, I put together these terrible PowerPoint presentations that I sort of inflicted my models on other people. The kind of presentation whereby slide 10, you can't remember what was on slide 1, and you were wondering why it was that you showed up for this presentation. And most of my presentations I wouldn't want to have sat through, but you have to go through these trials and problems to find answers on the other side of this difficulty. So it wasn't until, in 1990, Senge published The Fifth Discipline, which I read. And then I read it in 91 and 92 and 93 and 94. And I finally thought I understood it. And in it, I fell in love with archetypes because they seemed to give me a sense of how the world worked. And then I sort of forgot about them. And sometime later, I read Uncommon Sense, The Life and Thought of Ludwig von Bertalanffy by Mark Davidson. And in it talked about, in the 1930s, Bertalanffy proposed that there were fundamental underlying structures that operated across all branches of science, a statement which I initially thought was unbelievably ludicrous, but that's the way you react to something sometime. And though after thinking about it for a while, I sort of came to the realization that all of the branches of science are a fabrication of man, not nature. So why wouldn't there just be one set of structures that operated across all branches of science? And he wrote a paper called General Systems Teaching, where the intent was to describe how if you learned about these structures and how they were operating, you could take a lot of your learning from one discipline to another. You just had to learn about the structures that were operating and the labels that were on them in this different discipline. And I realized that what he talked about were actually the same archetypes that I read about in the fifth discipline. Though after some period of time trying to explain to people what archetypes were, I quit using the term archetypes and just went back to frequently recurring structures. And I still am fascinated by them, and I'll tell you about a number of different ways later in the presentation. But they give me a sense of understanding about how things work that I'm not sure I would get without them. So in 2010, I happened to connect with one amazing Scott Fort Monroe who was working on developing Insight Maker. And for a period of 5 years, I tested everything that he built and offered comments or thoughts about new functions or features that might be useful to the users. And about 3 years into this, Scott decided that we really ought to write a book called Beyond Connecting the Dots. And the intent was to make this an interactive book so that you could read about things and then actually click and interact with the model that was about the things that you were reading about. Some of them qualitative and some of them quantitative. We had over 400 sponsors on a Kickstarter project to write this book, and a number of them were kind enough to read everything we wrote and provide us feedback, and I think it was instrumental in making it what it turned out to be. But it wasn't long into it where some insightful person said, you keep talking about building models and you keep writing all this prose, why don't you just go build some models? Which was, painful feedback, but useful. And out of that came the bird feeder dilemma. And some of you have probably seen this before because I've been presenting this for like 10 years maybe. So I'm sitting in the kitchen having a pleasant breakfast, and my wife yells down from upstairs, "Are you finally going to clean up that unsightly growth around the bird feeder, because I'm getting tired of looking at it?" And when that happens, this whole set of events, historical events, sort of flashed before my eye, and as to how it was that I got myself into this predicament. You see, I deal with a lot of frustration on an ongoing basis, which detracts from my pleasant breakfast, and a pleasant breakfast helps me deal with the frustration. And over the past few days, birds outside on the railing have helped create a pleasant breakfast. And after several days of this, I decide, well, let me go ahead and install a bird feeder because it will increase the birds at the feeder and the birds outside and promote a pleasant breakfast. And it does that. And it does it even better than I expected because it increases the attractiveness of the garden, which attracts more birds, which adds to the pleasant breakfast. Though, have you seen the price of bird seed these days? So the birds at the feeder increase the need to buy bird seed, which adds to my frustration. And the bird feeder results in spillage, which increases the need to buy bird seed, increasing my frustration. And the bird feeder attracts the universal eating machine, also known as squirrels, which decreases the birds at the feeder, increases the need to buy bird seed, increases the spillage, increasing the need to buy bird seed, and I have more frustration. And the spillage promotes unsightly growth, which is what my wife is complaining about, which further increases my frustration. And the spillage also attracts rodents, which increases my frustration because I have to figure out what to do about them. and now the birds are pooping all over the railing, and I have to figure out how to clean that up on an ongoing basis. And my question is, how did I get myself into this predicament? And we'll come back to that in a moment. Some things seem like they're finished, but they're not really finished. I actually presented that story for years before I had an aha moment about it, and we'll get back to that in a moment. So, well, almost everyone that I interacted with online was aware that this particular model was initially unfolded in Insight Maker, which has a nice storytelling feature, though it wasn't all that I wanted it to be, and Scott wanted Insight Maker to be a stock and flow simulation model, not a qualitative modeling storytelling environment. So Fabian Zelansky sent me an email and said, you really ought to check out Kumu. So I went to kumu.io and attempted to create an account and found out I already had one. It seems as though I had looked at it 6 or 8 months earlier and decided that it wasn't going to get me to where I needed to go, though they'd been working on it, and it was beginning to look quite promising. So I connected with the Kumu people, and for several years I tested everything that they built and offered them comments about additional features, functions that might be useful to the users. And over that period of time, I got probably 90 to 95% of the features and functions that I was interested in for unfolding a model. Though since then, the other thousands of users, and I think there are over 500,000 of them at the moment, continue to ask for features and functions, and the programmers implemented all of those. So Kumu is currently an extremely rich environment, and I probably only use about 10% of it, though I actually love the 10% of it that I do use. During all this time, I'm still continuing to do research, investigation, and am concerned or confused about why are there so many models and methods that claim to embrace the systems paradigm. I'm doing just fine with stock and flow simulation models, though somebody pointed me to Michael C. Jackson's Systems Thinking Creative Holism for Managers. And in that book, he presents this 2x3 matrix. One dimension, he talks about the complexity of systems from simple to where you could envision being able to design and develop the system, to so complex where the best you could ever actually hope for is to understand it to some extent. And then the other dimension is the participants and the extent to which they have a coherent set of values and beliefs so that the stakeholders are well aligned in terms of their goals and beliefs and objectives. Pluralist, where they're not quite so aligned, but they can come to an agreement on things. And coercive, where the stakeholders will never agree on anything. And you could probably think of some group of stakeholders that fall in that category. And in each one of these dimensions, there are approaches that have, over time, proven to be useful in understanding and making progress in this particular arena. So I was just delighted for about a day until I became terribly, terribly depressed. The reason for the depression was I've now spent, decades developing some level of expertise in system dynamics. And Jackson tells me I got to learn a dozen different methods. And I just said, self, you're not that smart. So the way out of this, there has to be a way out because I'm still here, was to realize that all of the models and methods are just about understanding relationships and their implications. It doesn't matter what approach someone is using. They are simply endeavoring to understand relationships and their implications. And when I get back to archetypes, I find out that there are only 3 sets of relationships, which is why I developed this thing called the Foundation Trilogy. Not so much because I absolutely love Asimov, but it seemed to fit in that it's like the neutron, proton, and electron in the nucleus of the atom, and they're responsible for all of the elements in the periodic table. These 3 structures are responsible for every model that I have ever created. No matter how complex they might look, it's just some collection of independent growth, which in an isolated context, you can say there is some of this, but it violates one of Newton's laws, I guess. And there's reinforcing structures and balancing or goal-seeking structures. And that's all there is. So I don't have to argue with people about their methods. They can use whatever method they want to. I understand what it is that they're actually attempting to do, and I can contribute by asking appropriate questions, looking to understand relationships and their implications. So from there, connecting with the relationships and implications in my pathetic presentations and my work with Kumu, I made this connection between a model and a play, in that if you go to the play and you sit there and you watch the relationships unfold between the actors from one act to another, at the end of the play, if it's done relatively well, you leave and you take the story with you. Because as Bateson said, it's the pattern that connects. Though what I had done for years is inflicted my models on other people, very much akin to having the playwright walk up to someone, hand them the script for the play. They haven't seen the play, but here's the script. And about 5 minutes later, asking them, what do you think? There is no way that they can understand that piece of work in that format, in that time frame. It's ludicrous. And I essentially did that with my models endlessly. Even though I was trying to learn to unfold them over time, I was still sort of not getting it right. Or not. I learned later that what I was doing was still disastrous. Though at one point in time, I actually asked myself this question that seemed a question. Why would I ask myself this question? I asked myself, how do I create a model? You remember back here where I talked about where do I start? Not knowing where to start. Well, as it turned out, over the years, I had developed an approach to creating models that was extremely straightforward, though it sort of evolved, I don't know, in a way that I wasn't aware that it was evolving. It just sort of developed. So as it turns out, begin with a situation or topic to understand. There's a reason I didn't say problem. Ask what influences this. Ask what does this influence. And then ask 2 and 3 repeatedly for all elements until I don't have any more answers. Then I explain the model to someone else, asking them how to approve it. And then I try very hard not to be an idiot and argue with them about their feedback. As Covey said in The 7 Habits, seek first to understand and then to be understood. And the reason that I said situation or topic to understand was because, Ackoff commented that wherever it is that you initially think the problem is, a thorough investigation will almost always lead to an awareness that the real actionable problem is someplace else. We tend to identify symptoms, not problems. And then the last step is, and what are the implications of the understanding that has been developed? With the advent of ChatGPT and Gemini and Claude and a number of the other AI utilities, I have some help in this arena now that I can ask them about relationships that I'm unaware of, as opposed to having to harangue someone and ask them though, as it turned out, I'm still not there yet. I've realized that I need to do storytelling. I should have realized that back here when I did the bird feeder dilemma, but I wasn't quite there yet. So I set out and I created this relationship model for The Boy Who Cried Wolf, one of Aesop's fables, so that there's a situation where the townspeople hire this boy to tend the sheep, and they tell him if he cries wolf, they'll come running and protect him from the wolf. So after some period of time, the boy ends up being bored tending sheep, and he wants attention. So he cries wolf because the townspeople will come running. And when that happens, he becomes the center of attention, and it reduces his boredom, and we have a boredom relief loop. Additionally, if he cries wolf and there is a wolf, it represents truth, which adds to the beliefometer, which increases the likelihood that the townspeople come running, making the center attention, and it's an improved belief loop. Additionally, if he cries wolf and there is no wolf, it's a lie, which diminishes the beliefometer, diminishing the likelihood that the townspeople come running, making him the center of attention. So I now have a structure that I can present to someone and tell a story. And I was so excited about it, I sent it to someone. And a couple of days later, they sent me back the story from the wolf's perspective. Well, that was depressing and eye-opening, because I realized there's the boy's perspective, the townspeople, the wolf, the farmer, the sheep, the land, and they're all valid perspectives. And unless I understand and figure out how to integrate all of those perspectives, any attempt at intervention is nothing short of meddling in the situation, most likely to make it worse. So I'm still trying to figure out what I do in terms of storytelling. So I found this model that some people developed about having to do with unwanted births and unwanted pregnancies and sex education, and it's put together very well. And I could unfold and talk about the structure loop by loop and explain what's happening. And I'm not explaining it to you because the difficulty is I'm back to my terrible PowerPoint presentations, whereby loop 10, the person who's listening to me is not going to remember what it was that I talked about in loop 1. It's a nice picture, but it's overwhelming. The question is, what does it mean? Which was a question that I asked, which another one of those questions where I don't know where the question came from, though part of it I think had to do with a book by the Heath brothers called Moments, wherein they say that the best way to communicate is to take a clear insight compressed in time, delivered in a manner in which the audience discovers it. Now, because the audience discovering the truth, they have an aha moment and they own it. I often ask people why people don't wash their rental cars. I mean, I know a lot of people that don't wash their own cars, but I've yet to meet anybody that actually washes their rental cars. And I think it's a question of ownership. So the question is, how do you put together a story that does this? It takes a clear insight compressed in time, delivered in a manner that allows the audience to discover it. So while that's easy to say, I continue to find that it's far more difficult than I expected. And the question is, how do I take this structure that's unfolding, endlessly confusing, and figure out what does it mean? So I went back and thought about it for several weeks and realized, okay, there's a portion of this structure that talks about unwanted pregnancy and unwanted births, and then diminish the unwantedness, and I have a balancing loop. There's also a portion of the model that talks about unwanted births and how to avoid the unwanted birth, so I have another balancing loop. And there's a part that talks about how to avoid unwanted pregnancy, and I've got another balancing loop. The difficulty is that because there isn't an unlimited amount of resources, efforts to diminish unwantedness takes away from efforts to develop unwanted pregnancy avoidance. So I end up with a vicious reinforcing loop moving me in a direction that I don't want to go, and I realize that I have a shifting the burden structure. And on the other half of this model, if I spend efforts to avoid unwanted births, well, then it detracts from efforts here, and I end up with another reinforcing structure moving me in a direction that I don't want to go, and it creates another shifting the burden structure. And the realization was that this model, in all of its pieces, is really two just shifting the burden structures mushed together. And the aha moment for me was this relationship and this relationship are not in the other model. So I still have to figure out how to present this in a manner that allows people to discover an aha moment. I ain't there yet, but I'm working on it. Though what happens is someone says, well, okay, unwanted births and avoid unwantedness, and isn't there more to this than that? And I say, yeah, there is. This is an abstraction of all of these loops. And that's true for all three of these pieces, so that if someone wants to delve into the detail, we can do that. And you can do abstractions multiple levels if necessary and appropriate. So I'm still trying to figure out how to figure out what it means. Which brings me to tomorrow. And there's a reason that tomorrow looks a lot like the initial awakening, because I get the sense that I'm actually at the beginning. I have come to the realization that every model that I have ever developed is biased based upon my level of ignorance. And everything that I've ever done probably should be reviewed and redone because they're not what they should be. I mean, it's taken 5 decades to figure out how stupid I am. And that's probably not finished yet. Though there are things happening that seem to give me a lot of promise. Scott Fort Monroe, who developed Insight Maker, is currently working on ChatGPT SD, which, if you ask it a question, it will give you all of the pieces for a stock and flow simulation model. It'll identify the stocks, the flows, the variables, the links, and the formulas, and you can migrate it into Insight Maker, or any place else, I guess, if you want to. And his intent is to continue to evolve it to a point where it just migrates itself into Insight Maker so you can play with it. I'm also, for the past several months, I've been working with a programmer who, at times, I think he's from another planet because he's just doing things that mess with my mind. You take an environment like this and I ask it, what is propelling the perpetuation of this historic conflict, and what are the blockers for a peaceful coexistence between Israel and Palestine? And what it gives me, I'm not going to ask it to find it, I'm just going to reload it because it'll take it a couple of minutes. It'll come up and it'll give me this causal loop diagram. And not only will it give me a causal loop diagram, it will actually describe every one of the relationships in this diagram. It will tell me, and if I ask it, it'll write me a full-page description of this model. It will identify each one of the feedback loops and write a description of those. It will let me elaborate this model. What I like about it is when I ask it a question, it doesn't give me an Afghan strategy model right off the bat. It tries to give me a simplistic version of the most relevant relationships and allows me to investigate. Because from here, I said, okay, let's extend this around external political pressure. And when I did that, what it gave me was this. And then I asked it to expand around historical grievances. Where's it? Where's that? Right here, historical grievances. And it gave me this. It's beginning to look like the Afghan strategy model. And then about a willingness to negotiate, and it gives me this. All right? Which, is confusing. And so that what I've figured out is I have to drop back to version 1 and investigate some other track off of this, as opposed to trying to understand it all at once. And not only does it allow me to save it here, I can save it as CSV files that I can reload. I can save it as JSON files that I can load into Kumu, because here's the Israel-Palestine conflict model loaded into Kumu with all of the relationships defined. And someone asked me to present it, and I declined because I don't know what it means. It's a lot of pieces. It's as I've last 4 or 5 months, I've developed several hundred of these models, and I have yet to find a piece in the model that I wanted to take out. I've found an enormous number of pieces in the model that I would never have thought of. And it just, we're working on it. It's got problems. It's, it gets better and worse every day. But, in this, here are all the feedback loops. Here are all of the archetypes. And you can investigate them individually, trying to figure out what it means. So, here I am at the beginning, a new beginning, I guess. And if you got to this from the video itself, there's a link to this model in the notes section of the video. This is a one-page presentation on multiple pages. Think about it. If you get to the model itself, if you mouse over different aspects of it, you will see that there are links, and the links will take you to the pieces that I showed you. In other words, this will take you to the musing that actually describes this, and this will take you to a model and a presentation about the archetypes. And if you open this, here's this video that you're listening to at the moment. If you click on one of these, there's comments down here that I made notes to myself about what I was going to talk about. And if you want to provide, if you have questions or comments, send them to me at systemswiki@gmail.com, and I will do my best to answer them. And if you have a Kumu account, you can simply click on an element, go down here and click this, and you can initiate a comment right in the model itself, which will end up in my mailbox, which I will respond to, but it allows for a description of the interaction, the question and responses for any particular aspect of the model. So I'll post the links to this model in the notes section of the video. So hope you found it useful, and look forward to hearing from you. Take care. Bye.